Hello YouTube, Dave here again. We are returning to the Age of Worms adventure path as we take a look at Dungeon Magazine issue 126 from September of 2005 and Encounter at Blackwall Keep. Encounter at Blackwall Keep is an adventure designed for a group of 4 5th level characters for 3.5 D&D. They should reach 6th level during the course of the adventure and hopefully 7th level by the time that the adventure is completed. The premise or the overall summary of the adventure is actually pretty simple and straightforward. This is one of the most straightforward and like point A to point B adventure in this entire adventure path, at least based off of my recollection to this point. So don't quote me on that as being 100% accurate. It's just, looking at everything so far. But the premise of it has Aliston, the NPC that the players have befriended since the original Whispering Cairn adventure, the first installment of this particular adventure path. He is the smartest man in Diamond Lake, as he's referred to, either genuinely or sarcastically by the people there. It's really up to you how that gets interpreted. But he was researching the relics, the artifacts that the players retrieved from the Whispering Cairn during that first installment. And by now, he sort of researched them, he has some more information about them, and wants to explore the cairn itself to learn more about them, their significance. But before he can do that, he needs a favor of the player characters. It turns out that he has an appointment with his friend Marzina. Marzina is a battle mage at the Blackwall Keep, which is one of a few keeps that was set up within what's called the Mist Marsh. And they were set up in response to lizard folk attacks on people traveling through the marsh. The keeps went up over a decade ago, and they seem to have been really effective because shortly after they were built, the attacks by the lizard folk pretty much stopped altogether. So we'll see if it was the keeps or if it was something else that may have been responsible for that. But yeah, so he just needs people to accompany him on this, potentially dangerous trek. I mean, Aliston is a capable wizard, but he is still one individual, and traveling with people that he know are competent and capable, will put his mind at ease, so to speak. When the characters finally arrive at the Mistmarsh, where Blackwall Keep is located, they discover that the lizard folk that have been pretty well a non-issue since the keep's construction have returned, and they are laying siege to this keep with like 30 plus lizard folk, and being led by a warrior and their shaman, this druid that has the viper familiar. Aliston decides that he would be best served using his teleport spell to return back to Diamond Lake to inform the garrison there that Blackwall Keep is being attacked, and to muster up some reinforcements to come and help reclaim or to drive the lizard folk away. While he's doing that, though, he asks the player characters to sort of do whatever they can to lend assistance. Now, the player characters have to decide how they're going to enter the keep itself, like what route they're going to take to get there, when they're going to, at what point they're going to try to get there. If they're not hiding or making themselves sort of hidden or not obvious, people from the keep will spot them and actually call out to them, which could lead a group of lizard folk over to attack them. But however they decide to get to the keep, the next section of the adventure is just essentially them repelling these groups coming in, trying to break down the door, trying to scale the walls. And once the lizard folk have been reduced to either 10 of their members, so like 10 lizard folk altogether, or if the warrior, the leader, or the leader of this skirmish, at least I should say, or the siege, if he's defeated, then the remaining lizard folk will retreat back to their lair, where they may be encountered later on. So there's always that, right? But once the dust settles, the dozen or so defenders that are left thank the player characters for their help, but they also inform them that during one of the first skirmishes, the lizard folk actually broke into the keep and were able to capture 4 of the guards, or 3 of the guards, and the 4th individual they captured was Marzina, the friend of Aliston, the battle mage of Blackwall Keep. Now, she is the more recent battle mage. She is not the original mage that was here when the keep was constructed. That original mage, if the players inquire, or Alliston may relate this to them while they're traveling to the keep itself. Apparently he went insane one night and just simply walked into the mist marsh and was never seen again. We'll see if that's all the story or not a little bit later, or potentially during this section. But again, we'll skip over it for now because it is intended to be the finale of the adventure. So spoiler, I guess. But once that's revealed to the player characters, they are asked to go into the lizard folk lair to retrieve their kidnapped companions. And once they reach the lizard folk lair, they discover some interesting things have happened there. So there's actually a bit of a schism amongst the lizard folk that are currently there. Some of them are not happy with the fact that their previous king was overthrown and a new leader was put in place. This individual here, by the name of Shakok. And Shakok was this like outsider lizard folk, but he arrived with a black dragon by the name of Ilthane. And Ilthane has basically, if her proxy essentially was made the leader of this lizard folk tribe, she would agree to protect them and their young while trusting the lizard folk with one of her eggs that they can hatch and raise as like their own personal guardian. Because a decade ago, so around the time that these keeps went up in the mist marsh, and the defenders thought that they were so successful at building these keeps that the lizard folk decided to never attack. It's actually the lack of attacks was due not to the keeps being there, but due to the fact that about a decade or so ago, an entire generation of lizard folk hatchlings was wiped out throughout the mist marsh as these eggs hatched, and inside of them were the corpses of the lizard folk. But these corpses that had hatched were were filled with these writhing green worms. It devastated the lizard folk. It made it so that they didn't have the numbers to engage in any raids, and it nearly destroyed them altogether. So when Ilthane arrives and agrees to leave one of her eggs so that it can hatch and this black dragon can help protect the rest of these lizard folk while these lizard folk protect her young, it just seemed like a logical decision to make. So as the players are going through and they sort of discover some of this information, they deal with the lizard folk king. They can eventually make their way to the hatchery where all of these eggs for this tribe is being kept. And when they arrive there, if they break open the black dragon egg, this much larger, scaly-looking egg, they discover that there's no dragon inside, but instead it is filled with these green worms, like just hundreds and hundreds of these green worms. And when the worms erupt out of this black dragon egg, they enter several of the eggs nearby and release a whole bunch of these Caius spawnlings. So I think it's like 5 of these spawnlings per player character. So it ends up being, a pretty decent little challenge there to them. But when these worms are discovered and Ilthane's deception has been revealed, the lizard folk, if the players haven't already rescued the captives from Blackwall Keep, then the lizard folk will simply return them out of gratitude and let the players return to the keep with these captives. Now, Ilthane is not at the lizard folk lair. Like, the Ilthane hasn't been seen for over a month at this point. So it's sort of foreshadowing the fact that that's an encounter that the characters will have to be concerned about as they continue along this particular adventure path. But this is where you would think the logical conclusion would be, right? So the player characters, they defeated the lizard folk that were besieging the Blackwall Keep. They rescue the captives that the lizard folk were able to secure during one of the earliest raids before they arrived. They settle this leadership dispute for the lizard folk and uncover the fact that this black dragon that was supposed to be their guardian was lying to them all along and is actually the one responsible for these green worms and almost wiping out another generation of this lizard folk tribe. So you would think that this is where the normal conclusion of the adventure would be. However, there is a little bit of a twist, because back at Blackwall Keep, there was this door, this locked door, padlocked from the outside, that during one of those earlier skirmishes, probably the same one where the captives were taken in the first place, that lock was broken and that door was damaged. Now, behind that door, trapped in the cellar, is the original battle mage from Blackwall Keep, who didn't go insane and just simply run into the marsh and never be seen again. But he had heard rumors of these green worms, the same worms that wiped out an entire generation of those lizard folk, and went to investigate them, only to discover where at least some of them were. However, he became infected by them rather than just being able to simply study them. And upon returning back to Blackwall Keep, he transformed into a spawn of Caius. Now, if the players were very thorough about inspecting the keep for damages, then there was a chance that this encounter could have happened before going into the marsh after the lizard folk themselves. But it's most likely, just based on the pacing, based on like the things that have happened, that they more than likely would have gone after the captives first before really spending a ton of time looking around the keep itself. So this was sort of meant to be like the big finale. If this encounter takes place at the end of the adventure, so if they, succeeded in stopping the siege and then, rested up a little bit and then immediately went into the marsh after these lizard folk, they returned to discover that all of the surviving defenders that were there, all the surviving soldiers, have been wiped out by the spawn of Caius, and then they have to deal with this as sort of like the final encounter. So that's basically the way that this adventure goes. I know it sounds a little simplistic, but that's one, not a bad thing, and two, like it sounds simplistic, but there's still a ton of stuff that happens here. There's just a ton of like history that the players can learn, and there's a ton of foreshadowing and sort of the setting of the tone for the rest of the campaign. So that was sort of the summary section of the review. That's not the review section itself, that's the summary version of the events that take place. But as far as the review portion goes, this was an awesome installment to run. I don't want to keep saying that each installment's like my favorite one. I really want to save that for at the end of the campaign. But of the three that I've reviewed so far, this is easily my favorite of those first three installments. There was just a ton of fun stuff for the players to go through here. The siege itself was fantastic. Like that was a really great section to go through, like trying to figure out how they're going to reach the keep, and then the plans that they make once they're there to help repel the lizard folk and how they go about that. Now my players took a pretty straightforward approach where they simply charged towards the keep and got into a big skirmish or a big fight with a whole group of lizard folk, while the defenders found a rope to lower down for the players to sort of start climbing up, and that's how they approach that. But there are different ways that you can do it. They could wait for one of the skirmishes to kind of end and the lizard folk retreat to regroup before they, come back with another charge. So they could wait for that. They could wait for like morning, or they could wait for night, or they could just basically wait for a period where the lizard folk will have difficulty seeing them as they make their way to the keep. They could try stealthing their way there, or they could take like the straightforward approach. But however your group decides to do it, that section I really liked. I just loved the idea of letting them sort of come up with their plans to get there, and I made sure that they had some time to discuss strategies before the lizard folk launched another attack. So you can really let them be as strategic as they want when it comes to setting up and dispersing the defenders throughout the keep to make sure that everything's covered. So that was a section that I really, really liked. And I'm a huge sucker for lizard folk in general. They're one of my favorite creatures in D&D. And I feel like in more modern D&D, they're kind of overlooked, or they're one of those creatures that are typically reserved for just the random encounter charts or things like that. But I really like the way that they were utilized in this one. Going through their lair, discovering what had happened with their previous generation and how they were wiped out by these Caius worms. And then seeing that these worms were reintroduced to the lizard folk by this black dragon who wasn't there for the players to deal with this time around, but will be a threat that they have to tackle later. But inside of the lizard folk lair themselves, I mean, there are just some cool encounters, with some of the lizard folk, but my favorite one had to be with their garbage disposal, an advanced version of the Otyug. So it's advanced versions of creatures in third edition D&D basically add extra hit dice to them. And there was a formula for for every number of X number of hit dice that you add to them, you give them like an extra base attack, or you give them like bonuses to saves, or they get like extra natural armor, stuff like that. So, there was stuff there are things like that that you can do to sort of take a base creature and make it tougher. And this was a great version of that. I love the Otyugs, I love lizard folk. It was just, a great collection of things. I really, like I said, I really loved the backstory with the worms and how they nearly destroyed, or how they did destroy an entire, like I said, generation of lizard folk, which these lizard folk tribes throughout the marsh, struggled to rebuild from. And once they finally did rebuild, this dragon comes back, overthrows the ruler of at least this tribe, and reintroduces these green worms under the guise of it being a black dragon egg with a black dragon wormling inside. And again, the final encounter with the previous battle mage, now Spawn of Caius, I love that as well. Instead of just having a Spawn of Caius that you fight for the sake of having a Spawn of Caius that you fight, to set up the fact that, this is probably going to be a creature you fight or encounter several times throughout this campaign. I actually love the backstory, how the defenders of the key, how this wizard obsessed with these green worms gets infected by them, and then the guardians, they don't want to admit that, something really bad had happened, so they sort of try to cover it up and sweep it under the rug, only for it to sort of be their undoing once the opportunity arises. But overall, like I said, just a very solid adventure. I love the way this was written. I love the way it was designed. Some great encounters, some nice little plot twists sort of thrown in there. And yeah, I mean, you give the players an opportunity to really feel like heroes in this one. And, and my group really enjoyed that aspect of it. They were really into learning about what had happened to the lizard folk. And when they discover these green worms coming out of this black dragon egg, that was a huge moment in the campaign. I remember how grossed out and the players were at the worms sort of spilling out, and just this mass of this carpet of worms just kind of writhing around. It was just a great moment. And like I said, I don't want to declare this as my favorite installment of the adventure path at this point, because there's still 9 more to look at after this one. But of the first 3, this is easily, at least in my opinion, the best one. So that was my look at Encounter at Blackwall Keep. Let me know in the comments if any of you have either run through or played through this particular adventure, even if it wasn't used for the Age of Worms storyline itself. Sort of let me know what your experiences were. How did you or your players enter the keep during the siege? Did they take the straightforward approach? Did they, wait for a more opportune moment? Did they encounter the Spawn of Caius early? How did they deal with the lizard folk? Were they able to reach a peaceful agreement with the lizard folk after uncovering the deception of Ilthane, this black dragon? Or how did all that go down for you? Also, just as one sort of final note, I will say that, so this is the 3rd installment of the Age of Worms adventure path. During the 3rd, technically it was 2nd in the magazines, but it was intended to be the 3rd. For the Shackled City adventure path, also had a Spawn of Caius in there, but it was just sort of thrown in, and it never, you never really knew exactly why. It never really tied into anything. This adventure did a much better job explaining the backstory behind the Spawn of Caius that they encountered, and it just integrated it into the campaign a lot better than what they did with the other one, which was kind of a throwaway, at least you would think at first. But it is interesting to note that the Spawn of Caius that we encountered in the Shackled City adventure path was in the same installment that the players went up against the Ebon Triad. The Ebon Triad was the main antagonist that the players went up against in the 2nd adventure in the Age of Worms adventure path. where they went into like the mines and discovered like the cultists there, and with the manifestation of their overgod that they encountered at the end. So it is kind of cool looking back and seeing that they're actually tied together. There's a reason why the Ebon Triad was sort of looking at or had Aspanicaius in Shackled City, because the Ebon Triad and the Caius worms are, a major part of this campaign path. So it's just kind of cool to see how those two things carry over. And I wanted to make sure I made that point before I ended the video. But yeah, let me know what your experiences were with this one. Sorry it took so long to get back into this particular series of videos. It's not that I don't enjoy doing it. It's just that the summer was just kind of a hectic time. So it was just best to just sort of step back and take a little bit of break from things, but we're getting back into the school year. So at this point, should be a little bit easier, or there's less of me not being home to record these videos. So we should be getting back to a regular schedule with this, hopefully soon. Like if not with this one, hopefully the next one will be out in just a few weeks' time, and then we can get through the rest of this adventure path, because I love this adventure path. It's one of my favorites of all time. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all next time. Take care.